The bailiff had to bring in extra chairs. By the time the judge entered the courtroom that Wednesday morning, every seat was taken and a line of people stood along the back wall. Most of them were farmers. Some had left their work before dawn to make the hour-long drive. They came because they had heard what Ellen Dray was going to do, and they wanted to see it for themselves. Ellen sat at the defense table with her hands folded. She was 48 years old, weather-tanned face, calloused fingers, hair pulled back with a rubber band. She wore a clean flannel shirt and the least muddy pair of boots she owned. Beside her sat her lawyer, a man named Thomas Ridley, who had a single legal pad and 2 folders. On the floor next to Ellen's chair, resting against the table leg, was a metal toolbox. Green paint, most of it chipped away, dents on every side. The latches were scratched silver from decades of opening and closing. It was the kind of toolbox that lived in a barn, not a courtroom. Across the aisle sat Marcus Webb, 62 years old, silver hair combed back neatly, navy suit, white shirt, no tie. He had the kind of tan that came from a boat, not a field. His legal team occupied 3 chairs, lead attorney Robert Fain, a junior associate, and a paralegal with 2 rolling cases of documents. Webb owned 11 properties across the county. He had made his money in commercial real estate in the city and moved to the country 6 years ago. He told people he wanted to live a quieter life. What he actually did was buy farmland, rezone it and sell it to developers at 3 times the purchase price. Ellen's farm was the one he wanted most. The Dray property covered 190 acres on the north side of Kettle Ridge. The land itself was unremarkable. Hayfields, a cattle pasture, a small equipment barn, and a farmhouse that Ellen's great-grandfather had built in 1919. What made the property valuable wasn't the soil. It was the view. The North Ridge overlooked the entire valley. On a clear morning you could see 30 miles. A developer had already told Webb that the ridgeline alone was worth $3 million in luxury home sites. Webb's first offer to Ellen came 14 months ago. $11,000 per acre. Ellen turned it down the same day. His second offer came with a handwritten note. I respect what your family has built. $14,000 per acre. Final offer. Ellen didn't respond. His third contact wasn't an offer. It was a lawsuit. Webb's attorneys had found something in the property records. When Ellen's great-grandfather, a man named George Dray, purchased the property in 1919, the sale had been recorded by hand in the county clerk's office. The deed described the boundaries using natural landmarks: the creek to the south, the ridge to the north, the old stone wall to the east. But the western boundary was described only as the line of the wagon road. The problem was that the wagon road no longer existed. It had been plowed over decades ago, replaced by a fence line that Ellen's grandfather had built in the 1940s. Webb's attorneys argued that the original deed's western boundary was ambiguous and that the fence line did not match the historical road. They claimed that a strip of land roughly 22 acres wide along the western edge had never been properly conveyed to the Dray family. Webb had purchased the adjacent parcel to the west. If the court ruled the boundary ambiguous, those 22 acres could potentially revert to the adjacent property, his property, and those 22 acres included the ridgeline. Ellen had been blindsided. She didn't know the deed language was vague. She didn't know the wagon road was the boundary reference. All she knew was that her family had lived on and worked every inch of that land for 105 years. The pre-trial hearings went badly. Webb's attorneys presented historical maps showing the approximate location of the old wagon road. They hired a surveyor who testified that the current fence line sat 400 feet west of the road's estimated path. They produced title insurance analysis suggesting the original deed contained a latent defect. Ellen's lawyer, Ridley, argued adverse possession. It presented tax records showing the Dray family had paid property taxes on the full 190 acres for over a century. He brought in neighbors who testified that the fence line had been there since the 1940s. But the neighbors were old, their memories imperfect, and Webb's attorneys picked apart the testimony methodically. At a hearing 3 weeks before trial, Webb had been standing outside the courthouse talking on his phone. He didn't notice Ellen walking past until she was almost at her truck. He lowered the phone and called after her. "Mrs. Dre, buyer at Sucru's." He smiled broadly. "Still fighting?" Ellen stopped but didn't turn around. Webb walked closer. "You know how this ends," he said. "No judge is going to side with a farmer over a deed defect." He laughed. "It's just paper, Mrs. Dre. Take the money." Ellen opened her truck door. She didn't look at him. She said one word: "Wednesday." Webb frowned. "What about Wednesday?" Ellen got in the truck and drove away. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now it was Wednesday, and Ellen had brought the toolbox. The trial began with Webb's team presenting their case. Fain walked the judge through the deed language. He showed the historical maps. He presented the surveyor's analysis. Every point was clean, precise, and well documented. The western boundary description was vague. The wagon road was gone. The fence line didn't match. The 22 acres were in question. Then it was Ridley's turn. He kept his opening brief. He described the Dre family's continuous occupation. He referenced the tax records. Then he called Ellen to the stand. Ellen picked up the toolbox from beside her chair. The metal scraped against the floor. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery. Webb leaned toward Fain and whispered something. Fain shook his head slightly. Ellen set the toolbox on the wooden railing of the witness stand. The metal thunked against the wood. The judge looked at it. Mr. Ridley, the judge said. "What is this?" Ridley spoke calmly. "Evidence, Your Honor." Fain stood immediately. "Your Honor, a toolbox is not a legal exhibit." The judge raised a hand. "Let's see what's inside before we rule on admissibility." He looked at Ellen. "Go ahead, Mrs. Dre." Ellen unlatched the toolbox. The hinges creaked as she lifted the lid. Inside, the contents were arranged carefully. Not the way tools are thrown into a box after a day's work. Each item was placed deliberately, wrapped in cloth or separated by folded paper. Ellen reached in and pulled out the first item. A small iron spike about 6 inches long, rusted, nearly black. She held it up. Ridley spoke. "Mrs. Dre, can you identify this object?" Ellen nodded. "It's a survey stake, hand-forged." She set it on the railing. "My great-grandfather made these himself. He used them to mark the corners of the property when he first cleared the land in 1919. Fain frowned but didn't object. Ellen reached into the toolbox again. She pulled out a second item, a short length of chain, 3 links also heavily rusted. She set it beside the stake. "This is from the original gate chain on the western fence," she said. "My grandfather replaced the gate in 1943 but kept the chain." Webb shifted in his chair. Ellen reached in a third time. She pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and dark with age. She opened it carefully. "This is my great-grandfather's found journal," she said. She turned to a page marked with a piece of string. She read aloud, "April 12, 1919. Set the western line today. Follow the wagon road from the Kinney Stone south to the creek bend. Put stakes every 40 feet. Built the line straight." The courtroom was silent. The judge leaned forward. Ridley spoke. "Mrs. S. Dre, can you explain the significance of that entry?" Ellen nodded. "He wrote the western line. That means he surveyed it himself and placed stakes along it." She pointed to the iron spike on the railing. "These stakes." Fain stood. "A journal entry from 1919 is not a survey," Ridley responded. "It is a contemporaneous record of the original boundary placement by the original landowner." The judge looked at Fain. "Overruled." "Continue." Ellen reached into the toolbox a 4th time. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile. She unfolded it carefully and placed it flat on the railing. It was a hand-drawn map, pencil on paper, simple lines and notations. At the top, in careful handwriting, Dre Property, 1919. The map showed the boundaries. Creek to the south, ridge to the north, stone wall to the east, and on the west side, a dotted line labeled Wagon Road. Along the dotted line, small X marks were drawn at regular intervals. Beside them a note, stakes post April 1919. Ellen pointed to the map. My great-grandfather drew this when he first bought the land. She traced the western line with her finger. The Wagon Road ran exactly here, and he placed stakes along it to mark his boundary. She looked at the judge. Those stakes are still in the ground. The courtroom murmured. Webb's junior associate leaned over and whispered to Fane urgently. Ridley pulled a fifth document from his folder. Your Honor, last month we hired a licensed surveyor to conduct a metal detection sweep along the line indicated on Mr. Mester, Dre's 1919 map. He posted the report on the evidence table. The surveyor located iron objects at regular 40-foot intervals along the western boundary. He opened the report to a diagram. 7 of the original stakes were detected at depths consistent with over a century of soil accumulation. He placed the surveyor's diagram beside George Dre's hand-drawn map. The 2 lines matched. Ridley spoke quietly. The stakes my client's great-grandfather placed in 1919 are still in the ground. They marked the exact line described in the original deed as the Wagon Road. He looked at Fane. The boundary isn't ambiguous. It's been physically marked for 105 years. Fane was standing but had nothing to say. He looked at Webb. Webb wasn't looking at anyone. He was staring at the toolbox. Ellen reached into the box one final time. She pulled out a small black and white photograph, cracked at the edges. She held it up for the court. It showed a man standing next to a wooden fence post. Behind him, a line of freshly set stakes stretched across a cleared field. In the background, a faint track of a road was visible, 2-wheel ruts through grass. My great-grandfather, Ellen said. Standing on the western line, April 1919. She pointed to the stakes in the photograph. Those are the same stakes the surveyor found last month. The judge stared at the photograph for several seconds. Then he looked at Webb's legal team. He called a recess. When the court reconvened 35 minutes later, the judge spoke without preamble. The plaintiff has raised a legitimate question about the western boundary description in the original 1919 deed. He paused. However, when the defense has presented a contemporaneous journal, a hand-drawn property map, physical survey stakes confirmed by modern detection, and photographic evidence, all demonstrating that the original landowner established and marked the western boundary along the Wagon Road at the time of purchase. He folded his hands. The court finds that the western boundary of the Dre property was clearly established in 1919 and has been physically marked and continuously maintained for 105 years. The boundary is not ambiguous. The plaintiff's claim to the disputed acreage is denied. He struck the gavel. Case dismissed. Webb sat motionless. Fane began packing documents into the rolling cases. The junior associate closed a laptop. None of them looked at Ellen. Ellen closed the toolbox. The latches clicked shut. She picked it up from the railing and stepped down from the stand. Outside the courthouse, a woman from the next farm over hugged her. You brought your grandpa's whole life into that courtroom. Ellen shook her head. She held the toolbox by the handle, the way you carry something heavy that you're used to carrying. I just brought what he left me. A reporter approached. Mrs. Dre, Webb obtained no judge would side with a farmer. What do you say to that? Ellen looked at him. She shifted the toolbox to her other hand. He was right about one thing, she said. The judge didn't side with a farmer. The reporter frowned. Ellen turned toward the parking lot. He sided with the evidence. She paused. My great-grandfather just happened to put it in a toolbox. She drove home. She parked in front of the barn and carried the toolbox inside. She set it on the workbench next to the wrenches and the fencing pliers, exactly where it had sat for as long as she could remember. The iron stake stayed in the ground along the western line. The apple trees her grandmother had planted along the ridge were already in full leaf. The cattle stood in the shade of the barn the same way they did every afternoon, and the photograph of George Dray standing on his property line in 1919 went back into the toolbox, resting on top of the journal, where it had been for 105 years.